Hey everybody, this is Mike with BuzzTox, and I'm going to do a deep dive today breaking down episode 1 of Watchmen, along with all of the comic book Easter eggs which I could find. If I missed a few, please let me know, and remember to like and subscribe to us here at BuzzTox. Watchmen opens with Tulsa. It's 1921. We see a young black boy watching a cowboy serial in which a hooded hero apprehends a villain. The hero reveals himself to be a black sheriff. I don't know if this actually occurred in film prior to Blazing Saddles, but this serial is presented as an idealized version of the masked hero, and an inspiration to the boy, who gets interrupted by the reality of Tulsa during 1921. The child is pulled out of the theater. We see chaos, an unbelievable amount of racial violence going on in the streets. This was a real event which occurred in Tulsa, in which hundreds were injured, and many were killed after a young black man was falsely accused of assaulting a young white woman. And while bombs are going off in the streets and people are dying all around, the boy is smuggled out of the city in a car, and a letter is stuffed in his pocket which reads, "Watch over this boy." If we put aside racial violence for a minute, the scene definitely had Superman vibes going on, in which the hero is saved while the parents are left behind to die. The next scene, the car is crashed. The boy has survived, along with a baby who is crying. The boy, the protector now, picks up the child, who's wrapped up in the American flag, that very flag which has betrayed them both there in Tulsa. The whole thing's a little heavy-handed, but the image of the city burning in the background, the visual of it makes up for it in the scene and is an amazing intro. Flash forward to present-day Tulsa, a routine traffic stop of a white male driver by a black policeman. The masked officer is our first indication that we are in a different world. This is the Watchmen universe. A world in which the police have anonymity and hide their identities from the regular world. The driver attempts to hide the fact that he has a mask in his glove box, and the officer recognizes it as a Rorschach mask, which is worn by members of the 7th Cavalry, a white supremacist group. And for those of you who don't know, Rorschach was the main anti-hero of the original Watchmen comic. He's viewed as a martyr by the cavalry. And because of strict regulations on gun use by the police, the officer has to call into headquarters to have his gun remotely unlocked for use. In the process of unlocking his gun, he gets shot multiple times by the white male, now wearing the Rorschach mask. The shooting is the catalyst for the show, as the police try to hunt down the re-emerging 7th Cavalry terrorist group. We cut to a scene in which we're introduced to the Tulsa police chief, Judd Crawford. He's watching the musical Oklahoma, and is informed about the incident involving his officer, who has somehow survived and is in hospital. This is actually the second reference to Oklahoma so far in the show, the first being the name of the episode. It's summer and we're running out of ice. This is a line from the musical song Poor Judd is Dead. And to me, as soon as I figured this out, I knew that Chief Judd wasn't going to last long on Watchmen. We then have our first introduction to Looking Glass. The chief calls him Wade. He's a high-ranking officer and the police interrogator who goes over the shooting incident with the chief. And I believe Looking Glass is going to be the most interesting character within the story. He has the detective elements and the demeanor of Rorschach from the original comic, with the cavalry picking up Rorschach's negative qualities. Looking Glass and his reflective mask is also a reminder of the original Rorschach mask. He's actually the most reserved character on the show, calm and detached, while every other officer seems primed for violence. He wears the reflective mask so that others are forced to address their own selves rather than see who he really is. Looking Glass definitely has a dark past, which I hope is fleshed out during the season. The chief then informs the police officer's wife of the shooting, and we learn the officers in the Watchmen universe have secret identities, go to great lengths to protect these identities from the general public. They keep their families safe by doing this. We see news imagery now of Dr. Manhattan on Mars, destroying this castle-like structure, presumably his home on Mars. Manhattan is the only real superhero in the Watchmen universe. Everyone else is just a costumed adventurer. He's essentially a walking god. He can do anything. And he left Earth at the end of the original Watchmen comic because he was so sick of humanity. And presumably he's been living there on Mars, but now we see the house destroyed, so it must mean he's coming back to Earth in some capacity, or he's going somewhere else. But I think he's going to be showing up later in the show. After this, we've got the intro of our main protagonist, Mrs. Angela Abar, who's having a baking demonstration at her son's school. There's a reference to the comics with the comedian's smiley face that she makes out of eggs, and a bit of terrible dialogue about separating eggs and whites, which I assume is meant to remind us that we're going to be dealing with racial issues during the show. I think we've already addressed that, but they throw that in there anyway. The children ask her questions, and we learn that she was once a police officer who was attacked and shot during the White Night, a 7th Cavalry mass attack that instigated the wearing of masks by police officers. She tells the kids that she's decided to open a bakery, and a young white child asks her if she got the money to open her bakery because of Redfordations. This term is a seemingly racially insulting term for legislation which was brought in under the President Robert Redford, which gives reparations for victims of racial injustice. When the boy asks this question, Angela's son immediately attacks him. So we show that violence might run in that family. We cut to Angela driving her son home from school, sirens beginning to go off, and then, strangely enough, a shower of baby squids begin to fall on the car, and they dissolve after hitting it. And this seems to be a normal event in the Watchmen world. Readers of the comic will know that this is a result of the giant squid attack, which occurred in 1985. And later on, in the interrogation scene, we're meant to understand that the 7th Cavalry believes that transdimensional squid attacks, which everyone else thinks are normal, are actually hoaxes made by the government. It's interesting that they dissolve when they hit too, so no one can really analyze them. Even though earlier we saw in the children's playroom a diagram showing the squid in the background. So the kids must know about them, but they don't actually get a chance to take them apart. You can watch our previous video on what you need to know about Watchmen, which goes into more depth and talks more about the squids in the Watchmen universe, how they might be there. Angela gets home and she receives a page. Yes, there's no cell phones in this universe. The page says Little Bighorn, and it's from the Chief, which is a code for a 7th Cavalry attack. History buffs will know that the real 7th Cavalry were actually the main U.S. force who fought during the Battle of Little Bighorn. Angela then goes to her bakery, which is still yet to be opened, and on the way passes a man carrying a sign which says, "The future is bright." And this is a reference and an opposing view to Rorschach, who in the comics would disguise himself by taking off his costume, and he would hold a sign which read, "The end is nigh." We see a man holding a newspaper which says, "Veidt officially declared dead." And this is a reference to Adrian Veidt, the hero turned villain known as Ozymandias of the original Watchmen comic. And again, you can see our previous video on what you should know about Watchmen before you watch the show to learn a little more about him. She's then asked about her shop by an older black man in a wheelchair, who then mysteriously says, "You think I can lift 200 pounds? And this comes into play later on. Angela suits up into her Sister Night costume, gets all her Catholic-themed weapons from the bakery, and goes to Nixonville, a trailer park with known white supremacist residents, and attacks a man, throwing him into her trunk and bringing him to the police station. She shows no regard for the rights of individuals, and we begin to get this impression that is she a good guy or not? She's still a police officer, obviously in hiding, but what is going on with her? And we really didn't get a lot of character development with her in this episode. Cut to the gathered police force, who are watching a recorded propaganda video by the 7th Cavalry, in which they paraphrase quotes directly from Rorschach's journal. So those from the comics will know a little bit that Rorschach wrote a journal which gave the reality of what happened. And this might be seen as fake news by the people of the world. They've rejected Rorschach's journal of what really happened in 1985. And that's given rise to this cult. During this meeting of the police, the chief passes Article 4, which allows for weapons use and no warrants necessary for the police for 24 hours. A bit of martial law there. And it's a strange bit of foreshadowing when the masked officer called Panda points at the chief saying, "You're making a mistake." To which he replies, "Yeah, well, it's my funeral." Then they all stand up together and do some Latin. They say, "Quis custodiet ipsus custodes," which is from Juvenal, and it means, "Who watches the watchman?" To which they reply, "Nos custodimus," which is, "We watch." And this is the main line from the Watchmen comic. I thought it was pretty weird they threw it in here right now. It's, again, a little heavy-handed. And it's a commentary on power, the line. And it addresses the misuse of power. So what's going on in this context? Did the police, they don't seem to understand that they are themselves now the Watchmen? They don't see that it's cyclical, and Watchers become Watchmen. Power corrupts. As the episode goes on, we see the corruption of this power that they've given to themselves. Next, we have the interrogation pod scene. It's very Clockwork Orange, in which Looking Glass interrogates Angela's captive by subjecting him to preset questions, flash imagery, which is meant to provoke an unconscious response. Looking Glass knows immediately that the subject is lying. He's good at his job. And then Angela essentially tortures him until he tells her that the cavalry is on a cattle ranch. Again, we're supposed to sympathize with the police, I guess, in the show so far, but when we see them doing these sketchy things all over the place. We then have the raid on the cattle ranch. We see the cavalry stockpiling watch batteries, presumably for a weapon of some kind, and we get this insane, crazy scene in which cattle are mowed down by machine gun fire. Angela gets to show off her fighting skills and tries to capture one of the cavalry members, but he kills himself with a cyanide pill. This pill is, again, a reference to the comics in which Adrian Veidt, the hero/villain we talked about before, forces an attacker to take a cyanide pill. So a little nod to the comics there. The scene also has the chief and another police officer, higher ranking, called Pirate Jenny. They're riding in Archie. And this comes out of nowhere. It's awesome, but it comes out of nowhere. The aircraft is from a costumed hero, Night Owl, from the Watchmen comic. They destroy an escaping cavalry plan, and then they crash land on the farm. And it's unclear as to why random Tulsa police has this amazing vehicle. But I hope that it's just Night Owl tech, rather than the actual Archie that is maybe used by different police forces. There's this idea that people are throwing around that the chief is actually Night Owl, Dan Dryberg. And earlier we see a little Easter egg of an owl cup on his desk and a copy of the original Night Owl's biography, Under the Hood, which is this Minutemen superhero documentary which is playing throughout in the background that's going to come out and guide us through the history of the Watchmen universe. But I personally hope the chief isn't Night Owl, because the Don Johnson charismatic character is completely different from the comic version of Dan, he was quoted as being an impotent Clark Kent. You know, he's very shy and awkward. So past this, we cut to the English countryside, in which a gentleman is riding along to his country estate, which seems very similar to the same house we saw Dr. Manhattan destroy on Mars. And we see him ride past Skull and Crossbones Jolly Roger flag, which is an unclear reference to the pirate story, which is in the Watchmen comic, which everyone loves. The unnamed gentleman, who we all assume is Ozymandias, Adrian Veidt, from the comics, he's the master of the estate. And he's waited on by two individuals, Miss Crookshanks and Mr. Phillips, who appear to be androids of some kind, perhaps, indicated by Mr. Phillips' attempt to give Adrian a horseshoe to cut a birthday cake. They're celebrating a one-year anniversary, and this may be 1 year since he was declared presumed deceased, as indicated by the newspaper article that showed up earlier in the show. The master then tells them that he's created a play, a tragedy in 5 acts, which his servants will play leading roles, and it will be called The Watchmaker's Son. And I believe Ozymandias is not being literal in making a play, but he's referring to an elaborate plan he now has for humanity. He's all about these plans. And he believes, as the smartest man in the world, his kind of tagline as a superhero, that he's the only one fit enough to solve the world's problems. He considers himself the supreme watchman, and his plan will involve the watchmaker's son, in the comics, Dr. Manhattan. We then cut to what I like to call the long goodbye scene with the chief, and it's too transparent that he's going to die. He lovingly goes around the watch-shaped table, saying his goodbyes to family and friends, singing to them, and the whole episode is essentially a setup for us to like the chief. We see him having moments with many of his subordinates who see him as a father figure. There's this strangely intimate moment with Looking Glass in which the chief uses his reflective mask to tie his tie. There's laughing fits with the two female cops after the crash. Even the guy who gets shot, his wife tells the chief that he liked him. Everyone's meant to love him. And he references his own funeral. And then right before he goes out into the night to see the shot guy who came out of a coma, his wife warns him, you shouldn't drive yourself. So the only surprise in his death at the end is when the mysterious old man from earlier is sitting with the dead chief, holding the handwritten watch over this boy note, which indicates that the old man is actually the boy from the very beginning of the show. And also, the man's earlier mention of not being able to lift 200 pounds is now revealed as a reference to the hanged chief. So can this man see the future? Does he have a portion of Dr. Manhattan's power of being able to see all of time at once? And why is he involving himself with Angela? The last comic reference we see is the bloodstained badge of the chief, which is the same as the comedian's happy face button, which is bloodstained after his death at the beginning of Watchmen. It's the cover of the Watchmen comic. Both of these characters have died at the beginning. However, in the comic, the comedian went on to become a major character after his death in a lot of flashback scenes, and I'm hoping that they do the same thing with Judd. The show itself, it's a deep dive into some serious issues at play: police brutality, racial, social inequality, and what masks do to people. Masks, if we extrapolate this to our current world, masks might mean like the anonymity of social media, which we have, our own masks here. It's going to touch on pervasive issues between the far right and the left wing, which is dominating our current social climate. And my hope is that it somehow manages to ride the middle ground and gain an audience who doesn't feel like the issues addressed are being laid down too heavily handed. I also fear that some people might be lost in this world without having read the comic, and I fear that the lack of character development thus far might lose some potential viewers. So hang in there and keep watching. I honestly don't know how I would feel about the show if I hadn't read the comic myself, so please comment below if you aren't a comic reader, and tell us what you think about the show so far. Thanks for listening, and remember to subscribe to BuzzTox and like this, and continue watching our Watchmen videos. Thanks a lot, everybody.